Now that we've discussed the components of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we can use these components to put them together to analyze the changes in real GDP and in the price level. So beginning the next slide, we're going to bring together the aggregate demand curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the long-run aggregate supply curve all into one graph, so we can explore the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium for the entire economy. So on the right side of this slide, you see a figure showing the economy in the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. We have the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping, the aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping, and the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is a vertical line. Now, the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, all three of these curves are going to intersect at the equilibrium point. So this is when the economy is in short-term equilibrium and GDP is at its full employment level. So in our model, for simplicity's sake, we're going to assume that there's no inflation in the economy. So the price level is going to be stable at 110, which is our equilibrium point. And there's no growth. So long-run aggregate supply is fixed at 17 trillion. So we can understand this, let's work through an example. So let's suppose that interest rates rise. What this is going to do is cause firms to reduce their spending on factories and equipment, so they're making less capital investment. And it's going to cause households to reduce their spending on new homes. So this decline in investment for both households and firms causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. So we're going to move from 81 to 82, as you can see in the figure on the right. So the result of this move from point A to a new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. This is going to be where the aggregate demand 2 curve intersects the original short-run aggregate supply curve, so point B. In this new short-run equilibrium, the real GDP is going to decline from $17 trillion to $16.8 trillion. So it's going to be below its potential level. Because remember, the long-run aggregate supply curve shows the potential real GDP. So this lower level GDP will result in declining profits for many firms and layoffs for some workers. So what we're going to see is the economy move into a recession. So when we talked about the business cycle in previous chapters, this is what's going on in the macroeconomy as we enter into a recession. But eventually, because you know how business cycles work, recessions are going to end. Because there are forces at work that are going to push the economy back to the potential GDP in the long run. So if we keep working with this figure and looking at it, we can see how the economy moves from recession back to the potential GDP. So when we shifted from the original aggregate demand curve to the new aggregate demand curve, so from 81 to 82, that leads to a short-run equilibrium with the price level dropping from 110 to 108 at point B. Now, once we reach this lower price level, what's going to happen is that workers and firms adjust their expectations of the price level. They adjust their expectations to be lower than they had previously been. What that means is firms are going to be willing to accept lower wages, and firms are going to be willing to accept lower prices for the goods and services they're offering. And this includes input costs. So what's going to happen is the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. So it's going to move from the short-run aggregate supply curve 1 to short-run aggregate supply curve 2. Now at this point, the long-run equilibrium is going to be restored at point C. Here at point C, we see the new short-run aggregate supply curve crosses the new short-run aggregate demand curve at the same point that the long-run aggregate supply curve crosses through them. So we have, again, all three of those curves crossing each other at the same point, this time at point C. But now the shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve is not going to happen instantly. It's going to take some time. And that's why recessions tend to take some time. We don't have this immediate snap back to GDP growth. So the important conclusion I want you to take from this is that a decline in aggregate demand causes a recession in the short run. But in the long run, it only causes a decline in the price level. So economists refer to the process of adjustment back to potential GDP that we just explored as an automatic mechanism because it's going to occur without any actions by the government. But there are alternatives to waiting for the automatic mechanism to end a recession. Those alternatives are the government using monetary or fiscal policy to try to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right and restore potential GDP more quickly. Sometimes in the past, for instance, the Depression of 1920, the federal government has not acted, and the Federal Reserve did not act. And they allowed the economy to recalibrate itself. But more recently, the federal government has taken a more activist role in trying to reduce recessions. So we've seen the U.S. government in the past do both. So now let's look at what happens during a business cycle expansion. So let's suppose, for example, instead of becoming more pessimistic, many firms and consumers became optimistic about the future profitability of a new investment, like we saw during the information technology boom and the telecommunications advancements in the late 1990s. So the resulting increase in investment from these new positive outlooks about the profitability of this future technology is going to result in shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, like we see in the figure here on the right side of your slide. So equilibrium is going to move from point A to point B. When equilibrium moves from point A to point B, real GDP is going to increase to $17.3 trillion. And the price level is going to increase from 110 to 113. In this case, real GDP is going to be above potential GDP. So firms are operating beyond their normal level of capacity. And some workers who would ordinarily be structurally or frictionally unemployed, who would not be in the labor force, are unemployed, or are employed, excuse me. So what's going to happen is the unemployment rate falls below the natural rate. It's going to raise wages, and increased demands for goods are going to raise their prices. Just as an automatic mechanism brings the economy back to potential GDP from a recession, an automatic mechanism brings the economy back from short-run equilibrium beyond the potential GDP. This is what we see in the second part of this example. So the shift from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2 initially leads to short-run equilibrium at point B. So the price level rises from 110 to 113. At this point, workers and firms are going to begin to adjust to the price level being higher than they expected. So what happens? Again, workers push for higher wages, and firms demand higher prices for the goods and services they're selling. In addition, there's going to be low levels of unemployment resulting from the expansion, so it's going to make it a lot easier for workers to negotiate for higher wages. And you're going to have, because there's fewer workers unemployed, if firms want to poach workers from another firm, what they're going to have to do is offer higher and higher wages to get them to be willing to move to a new company. So as a result of this, we're going to see the short-run aggregate supply curve shift to the left. So we'll move from short-run aggregate supply 1 to short-run aggregate supply 2. And then it'll intersect the new aggregate demand curve at point C, which is going to be on the long-run aggregate supply curve. By the time the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up to point C, so the new equilibrium is at point C, the economy will be back in long-run equilibrium. And again, the shift from short-run aggregate supply curve 1 to short-run aggregate supply curve 2 is not going to happen instantly. It's going to take some time for this process to occur. So in our previous two examples, we had the aggregate demand curve move suddenly. But what if we didn't have that? What if instead the short-run aggregate supply curve is something that was moving? Economists call this a supply shock, so let's explore this. For example, let's suppose there's a sudden increase in oil prices. What this is going to do is shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. So we're going to move out of our short-run equilibrium, our long-run equilibrium. We're going to increase the price level from 110 to 112. At this new point, we're also going to decrease the real GDP from 17 trillion to 16.7 trillion. So notice at this new equilibrium point, we end up with a price level that's higher, so it's at 112 instead of 110, and real GDP is lower. So this combination, this two negatives of higher inflation but lower real GDP, is called stagflation. And for those of you that remember the 1970s, you'll remember the high unemployment, the low GDP, and the high inflation that went along with this. This is what happens when there's a supply shock, when there's something, and prices of inputs are increasing. So once we reach this period of stagflation, what's going to happen? Well, remember, the economy has these automatic mechanisms and they're going to occur when there's a supply shock as well. So when we experience the stagflation, so high inflation during a recession, what we're going to see is unemployment and reduced output in the recession. Workers eventually are going to be willing to accept these lower wages because they want to be able to work. And firms will be willing to accept lower prices as they are just want to clear their inventories and get rid of all the items that are left on their shelves. So what's going to happen is the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift from short-run aggregate supply curve 2 to short-run aggregate supply curve 1. So we're going to move the equilibrium from point B back to point A. So real GDP is going to reach the potential GDP at the original price level. Now, it may take several years for this process to be completed, and may be a painful process, but the economy will work itself out back to that point. Now, the government could use fiscal or monetary policy to bring the aggregate demand curve to the right so we can reach the potential GDP in a long-run equilibrium much more quickly. But what it's going to do is result in permanently higher prices. During the 1970s, what the government tried to do was engage in price controls as one way to lower inflation. Another thing they did is tried to ration goods. So, for instance, you could only buy gasoline every other day. You weren't able to buy gasoline every single day as an attempt to ration it. Eventually, stagflation persisted for so long and the inflation rate got so high that the Federal Reserve stepped in with contractionary monetary policy for a long time. And in the next chapter, we'll talk about the Federal Reserve and how they engage in monetary policy and what tools of monetary policy they have. So how long is the long run of macroeconomics? Once a recession starts and a recession's underway, how long does it take for real GDP and employment to return to the levels that they had achieved at the previous business cycle peak? So since 1950 on average, it takes about 6 quarters or 1.5 years for the economy to reach its previous peak. But of course, there's a lot of variability across recessions. As we can see, the figure on the right, the recession from 2007-2009, the financial crisis, it took a long time for the economy to recover to the previous peak. Whereas other recessions like 1990-91 or the dot-com bubble in 2001 took much less time. And what about employment? How long does it take for employment to recover after a recession? Well, depending on the recession, again, it takes different amounts of time. So in 2001, the dot-com bubble, that was called a jobless recovery at the time. And at the time, it was the longest it took for employment to recover for a recession since 1950. For 2007, 2008, the financial crisis, it took 24 quarters for the employment level to get back to where it was at the previous business cycle peak. So there may have been something different going on there. Some believe it's because it was a financial crisis. In financial crises, when there's trouble in the banking sector along with the recession, that these are deeper and longer lasting recessions. There may have been other structural changes in the economy that came to a head in this point, and we may have seen the jobs that are needed in the economy changing over the period. So there's a lot of things that are going on here.